volunteers, on behalf of the State Library of Louisiana and the Louisiana Center for the Book, welcome to this program. A couple of requests. Please silence your cell phones and please respect our host rules. No food or beverages are permitted in the spectator area. Today we have two presenters, and these gentlemen happen to be Mr. and Reverend Ed King and Dr. Trent Watts, who co-authored a book, Ed King's Mississippi, Behind the Scenes of Freedom Summer. And before we hear from them, we will have an introduction by Mr. Steve Yates of the University Press of Mississippi.
Thank you very much for coming to this celebration of Ed King's Mississippi, Behind the Scenes of Freedom Summer, published by University Press of Mississippi. University Press of Mississippi is the publishing arm of the 8 state universities of Mississippi. From our offices in Jackson, Mississippi, each year, we bring to global market over 200 author creations in traditional print, print on demand, and electronic book forms. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today Reverend Ed King. Reverend King was a major figure in the civil rights movement in Mississippi, a chaplain at Tougaloo College. He also became a key leader in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and a delegate of the MFDP at the 1964 and 1968 Democratic National Conventions. King ran for lieutenant governor and was on a ticket with a famed civil rights leader, Aaron Henry, who ran for governor of the state of Mississippi. One of the most wonderful things that he did during the civil rights movement was to carry a small camera and take good notes and keep a great memory, for very often he was the only white Mississippian in the room trusted to hear what was going to happen next for freedom in the state of Mississippi. Trent Watts is an associate professor of American Studies at Missouri University of Science and Technology in Rolla, Missouri. He is the author of One Homogeneous People, Narratives of White Southern Identity, and White Masculinity in the Recent South. He joined with Reverend King to make this wonderful book happen, one that I must say Mississippians have been waiting on for many, many years. Trent Watts.
Thank you, Steve. And again, thank you all for coming out on this rainy afternoon. Let me start by thanking Steve for his introduction and for the outstanding job that the University Press of Mississippi did with this book. It's a beautiful, I think, well done, as well as we hope a useful book. Let me say a little bit about the context of the work that the book contains. In the summer of 1964, about 1,000 volunteers came to the state of Mississippi, mostly Northern College students, but also doctors, attorneys, healthcare providers, other professionals. Much of the work that they came to Mississippi to do that summer was to register black voters. Mississippi had the lowest percentage of black registered voters in the nation, something on the order of 6% in the summer of 1964. The volunteers worked with local people, with long-established grassroots level leaders, and over the course of the summer, they built freedom schools where young people and old people were taught rudiments of civics, ways to navigate the very treacherous and perilous voter registration process in Mississippi. They were taught and participated in various arts programs and generally worked to try to overcome some of the legacy of the 100 years of Jim Crow that had settled onto Mississippi after the ending of slavery. Now, if one grew up in the state of Mississippi in the late 1960s, one heard very little, in public at least, from official sources, newspapers, schools, politicians, the pulpit, except that Mississippi's way of life was under assault, and that this assault amounted to an assault on the American way of life, because at base, the common enemy to both the Mississippi way of life and the American way of life was a communist insurgency. It's easy for us, 50, 60 years after these events, to smile at invocations of the threat of communism, but to most Americans, most Southerners in those years, that threat was very real. The president said so, the head of the FBI said so. From year to year in the early 1960s, events demonstrated to many white Mississippians that indeed the roots of their culture were under siege. In 1961, the Freedom Rides brought integrated groups of riders across the South testing the integration of public transportation facilities. There were efforts at black voter registration in Macomb, Mississippi, efforts that were pushed back violently. In 1962 came the racial integration at the University of Mississippi with James Meredith, and also voter registration efforts in the Mississippi Delta. In 1963, the Jackson movement against segregated public accommodations and the freedom vote to demonstrate that black Mississippians did very much desire to exercise their constitutional rights. So year by year by year, leading up to 1964, the events covered in this book, the atmosphere for people who wanted to see change in Mississippi grew more perilous. Questioning the established order brought consequences for blacks and whites alike in Mississippi, and to challenge that established order demanded an unusual tenacity and determination to act upon one's beliefs. Now, as we reach the 50th anniversary of so many pivotal events in the Mississippi and the Southern civil rights struggle, I believe, along with many other Mississippians and scholars, that Reverend Ed King deserves fresh recognition for his work on behalf of the state of Mississippi and its citizens, black and white. Many Mississippians, black and white, had concluded by mid-20th century that the state was beyond redemption. Reverend King might have joined many other well-educated young white Mississippians and taken part in the migration that took so many Mississippians in search of a freer climate. Instead, wrote Reverend King, he believed that there was no hope of the white community in Mississippi doing anything significant to change itself. So in late 1962, Reverend King and his wife Jeanette, who were both native white Mississippians, decided to return to the state to participate in the movement for social change that was spreading in the state. Now they knew, as did black Mississippians, that such work carried the possibility of danger, as well as ostracism from those people who admired or feared or simply acquiesced in the status quo. The Kings' involvement in civil rights work would cost the Kings and their families many old friendships. In fact, Reverend King's interest in racial justice and reconciliation had already caused enough controversy by 1964 to force his parents from the state. A fellow Methodist told the Kings, his parents, "I want to tell you something very important, and I hope this makes you feel better. I do not for a minute believe that you are communists. I have listened to some of the people who say you are, and I don't accept their arguments. However, I'm afraid your son is. Now, rhetoric like this demonstrates the powerful confluence, as I mentioned earlier, of anti-civil rights and anti-communist rhetoric in the state and the nation at the time, and explains why people saw questioning of the Jim Crow order as radicalism, if not, they saw it as deep irresponsibility, if not outright radicalism. And such attitudes produced an atmosphere of very great terror for Ed King and other civil rights groups. Over time, wrote the distinguished civil rights historian John Dittmer, Reverend King became the most visible white activist in the Mississippi movement. Dittmer notes that King was ostracized by his family, scorned by his colleagues in the clergy, and later shunned by New South white moderates who entered the political arena only after it was safe to do so. Reverend Ed King bore witness to his faith, took a stand for basic civil rights for black Mississippians. No other white Mississippian so consistently put himself on the line in the 1960s and beyond for liberal Christian principles as did the Reverend Ed King.
Thank you, Trent. Thank you, Steve, press. Thank you, folks, for stepping out of the stormy weather. Stormy weather is sort of what my book is about. One of the main tasks I had during the civil rights period was traveling throughout the country to speak at churches, civic groups, various organizations about what was going on. In the first 4 or 5 years I was doing that, people were polite, but it was unbelievable. With Freedom Summer, we brought in 1,000 people from around the country, some from the University of Virginia, from Tulane, from Southern schools, but most were Yankees. They brought media attention with them, and that helped. In the midst of bringing them in, 3 of our staff volunteers were killed, the famous Neshoba martyrs. And people realized how serious Mississippi was, and that Americans, black and white, on the outside and the inside, had to struggle to face this. When I'd make those trips around the country, I'd give the most recent number of terrorist attacks, that sort of thing. I would sing some freedom songs and explain them. I would quote our great leaders like Medgar Evers or Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer or somebody like that. But sometimes I would want to depart from the specifics, and usually after a lecture we'd get around to just sharing stories. And storytelling is a different way of approaching truth. I will have a few snapshots to show you with a few comments in this time we have together. First, I want to read something to you from the book. It was my way of trying to explain everything that had happened from our roots up until the crisis of Freedom Summer in terms of who we are as Southerners. And I used the chapter title as Dogs. And it's sort of wonderful that you have a dog as the symbol on the brochure and the booklet for this wonderful Louisiana Book Festival. I have a few Louisiana connections. My father was raised north of Shreveport, near Mooringsport, Cotton Valley, Oil City, up in that part of the world, Vivian, and so on. He also was among the students from working class whites that Huey Long, as governor, helped get to LSU, and he was among the first students after the new campus was being built here. I have taught as an adjunct at Millsets College and as a faculty member of Ole Miss, so I'm partial to Ole Miss. Dogs are important. A long, long section on what dogs and animals mean. This really hit me a few weeks ago when we watched on television the refugees pouring into Hungary people building the fences. I want you to imagine, like I would tell an audience in Nebraska or somewhere, imagine this scene. Some of you may have seen it. The Hungarians built a fence, put barbed wire on it, and then brought out German shepherd dogs, men with guns, to try to save their way of life. They were honorable in their intentions. After a week of this, there was a photograph of thousands of refugees being hoarded in one place, and the soldiers throwing sandwiches from the back of a truck. I hope some of you saw that. I saw that, and that threw me back to 1963 in Jackson, when we had a concentration camp-like setting, when the police came and could not imagine that 500 high school black students had marched and gone to prison. And the police put out barrels of water like animals would drink from, because the police used the state fairgrounds, straw on the ground, and put black children, unlike Birmingham, which was bad enough. This is 2 weeks after Birmingham. Children were put into straw pens, told if you were thirsty in 103-degree weather, lap like dogs. And some kids told me they had their heads shoved into the water. I wasn't there, but I believe it. I have been tortured in that prison several times myself. And the stories people couldn't make up. After this water business, the police came in and had bread and bologna, and somehow enjoyed saying blacks are just dogs, and threw the bread in the air and told the kids, jump for it, you in dogs. And then here, 50 years later, I see police in Europe with hungry refugees saying, we've got to give you food, jump. Okay, background. Now let me read some Mississippi story to you about dogs and police dogs. There are all kinds of dogs in Mississippi. Some black people even keep special dogs to smell out water moccasins and bark out a warning. And up in the hills and even in the Delta, there are many poor whites who have their hunting dogs and faithful friends like Old Blue, so loved that a man might want to lower his dead dog down into the grave with a silver chain, crying out his name, here Blue, here Blue. But Mississippi never had long silver chains for black Mississippians, only cold iron chains. Slavery times, and until recently on convict chain gangs, the fugitive man who escaped his bonds, desperate for freedom, was tracked down by the sheriff's bloodhounds, their terrible bay summoning the lynch mobs, more eager for the death of this man than his trial for justice. When the 1961 arrival of the Freedom Riders, white Mississippi began to have its love of a new style, police dogs, the handsome German shepherds who had been viciously trained in Missouri, where my friend teaches, by a German immigrant in Springfield who was an ex-Nazi guard, and dog handlers now advised American police. And I think that's trickled down through the last 50 years, but remember those origins. In the police stations and jails in Mississippi, these dogs were kept on long chains that added an awful rattling, clanging sound in the roaring of the beast. Imprisoned movement people were forced to pass near the dogs. The growling of the dogs was never as horrible as the laughter of the police. Once I thought the dogs would actually kill me. In the winter of 1964, white police were waiting, as often happened, outside the gates of Tougaloo College. I was driving, and the police instantly followed us all the way into downtown Jackson. Two students, Hannah and Joan Trumpauer, were with me. We had all been in jail before, and reasonably assumed this time we were on the way to jail again. I made a fruitless effort to avoid yet another false traffic charges, which meant jail, 12 months, and $1,000 fines. Several miles later, the familiar flashing police light finally came on. I stopped and was told to follow the police into the underground parking lot of the city jail. This was familiar territory where many friends had been beaten. Far across the unusually empty parking lot, underground, was the elevator, where even more torture and beatings were routine. The arresting officers ordered the three of us to stand next to my car. The white officer walked over to the other side, and then a voice cried out, "Turn them loose, let the dogs kill them." We heard the ferocious barking and howling of the police dogs. The dreaded German Shepherd monsters were charging down on us. We backed against my car. There was no place to run. Two immense dogs leaped towards us, lunging up at our faces and throats. I held my breath and said a silent prayer. The women screamed. The dogs snarled. The police cheered and laughed. The dogs were still on their chains, held by the delighted white police who had not actually released them. The front paws and teeth of the beast were no more than a few feet away from us. Had one of the women stumbled and fallen towards the dog, she'd have been killed. Had I tried to run off or to hold off the dogs, I'd have been killed. More policemen entered the parking garage. Their laughing mingled with the growls of the dogs and the clanging of their chains on the concrete floor. All the combined noise reverberated throughout the room. I wanted to scream, but did not dare because of the awful feeling that I might never be able to stop. What a relief it was to be placed in that dreaded elevator where you can almost see the bloodstains. This time we were not beaten, and the dogs did not ride up with us to the cells on the 5th floor. We were taken to the familiar place for mug shots and the standard cursing, and then jailed on the false traffic charges, and a few hours later were released by a movement lawyer. I go on to talk about how the police were cheered in the whole white community. The police were brought to civic clubs where the police, to the upper middle class white men who ruled the city, would demonstrate their dogs' tricks. And then white women began having the dogs come to their social teas in the afternoon, and the dogs would be put through their tricks. I don't think they ever brought any black children to the white ladies' teas. I understood why we needed a crisis moment. In the summer of '64, 3 people I knew, 2 of them very well, were killed in Neshoba County. For 40 days or so, a search went on for their bodies. In the midst of this time, Dr. Martin Luther King came to Mississippi. I was asked by the black civil rights leaders to be the host for Martin Luther King and take him on a trip to hell into Neshoba County to view the ruins of Mount Zion Methodist Church, the first church bombed in the state, and to talk with the survivors. I have a few pictures here. Is this one up? Yes, I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. In this picture, just a snapshot, because I'm their host and they're with them. Andy Young near the front, Martin Luther King in the middle, Reverend C.T. Vivian with him, John Lewis behind that. I wasn't taking them because they were my friends. I was their host. We were together, and we were risking our lives. The only church in that county, and for 4 counties around where Dr. King could have spoken, had been burned to the ground. We were able to get him into a nearby pool hall. And here's Dr. King playing pool with a few of the guys who might have been 20 years old, 21, almost ready to vote. But a lot of the kids followed us in. That I didn't think was super unusual. I was taking my snapshots, but it's a wonderful way. If I told a group in Detroit that Dr. King was a pool hall, yeah, people would have said, yeah, okay. He then would talk to the people around him, especially the kids, and they were rapturous in listening to him. Let me read some from this section, one of these. I think the men were very impressed with Martin's presence in the pool hall. He certainly identified with the grassroots. Among some of the local black people, a kind of Puritanism prevailed. It would not be as strong today, but it did exist then. Some of them would have been uncomfortable with his being in that kind of a place because they themselves were trying desperately to hold on to a little more secure, respectable lifestyle. His playing pool would only be a few minutes. Then he would start talking, and we would be working at the back of the crowd with voter registration materials. Won't you take this? Will you take this home to your parents? Martin spoke of love, nonviolence, and politics. Martin was well aware that many black children had followed him as we walked around and now were staring through the windows into the pool hall. The children and teenagers were his focus in some of his remarks, and I made notes when Martin spoke, or Fannie Lou Hamer, or Hubert Humphrey, or Bayard, or what have you, discreetly, but they knew I was a teacher, so I could take notes. Quote, Dr. King, they, those missing men, have probably given their lives for your freedom and mine. I see a lot of young people here. Now, you have been born into a world that presents you with so many conditions that cause you to feel that you are inferior, that cause you to feel less than a white man. But if I can leave anything with you this afternoon, I want each of you to feel that you are just as good as anybody else that God created in the world. I want you to know that you are somebody and that you are God's children. This pool hall scene was anything but jovial for me. The kids seemed to love it. We were crowded inside the hot, dark rooms. I was impressed with Martin's words, but worried that a small bomb in that place would kill all of us. And then Martin spoke about fear. He was speaking to me. Quote, with all the conditions you live with here, there is temptation for you people to be afraid. But if we are going to be free as a people, we've got to shed ourselves of fear, and we've got to say to those who oppose us with violence, you can't stop us by bombing a church. You can't stop us by shooting at us. You can't stop us by brutalizing us, because we're going to keep on keeping on until we're free. I mentioned that some of the black Sunday school teachers were a little awkward feelings about Martin being in a pool hall. But the real comment about the pool hall came from a great white minister in your state, this state, in New Orleans. Reading from the book again. One white evangelist from New Orleans, the Reverend Bob Harrington, became quite involved in the Neshoba case. Harrington had built a reputation preaching to strippers and other sinners in the French Quarter, where he, so he announced, was known as the, quote, chaplain of Bourbon Street. This Bourbon Street chaplain attacked Martin Luther King as, quote, a false prophet, seeking gain for himself and not for the kingdom of God or his own race. I challenged Martin Luther King to explain how he calls himself a minister of the gospel when the gospel is the good news of the Lord. Some preacher this Martin Luther King is, he comes into town and instead of a Bible, he uses a pool stick. Well, our Jackson white newspapers were glad to pick up on support in New Orleans. Let me shift to a different kind of story in the book. My home not only was a host for a summit meeting with Dr. King, Andy Young, Bayard, and so on, to plan national strategy for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, but our home was a center for people who wanted refuge or quiet or anything else. Our home during Freedom Summer operated as a center for high-level strategy sessions, a guest home, rest home, things I've just talked about. Moments here were generally a delightful time. Early in the summer, one white volunteer came to us with a serious problem. Soon enough, the serious problem came into our living room. This young man was Steve Bingham, who was based in the Delta and was working with Hollis Watkins and others in Holmes County. He had a strange story indeed. Steve explained that his grandfather had been a U.S. Senator from Connecticut, and this family was known and well-liked by Mississippi's own senators, Stennis and Eastland. Senator Jim Eastland had discovered that the young Bingham was working in his own Delta country, a likely enough place for someone to be murdered or just disappear. So Eastland arranged protection for Steve, nobody else. Members of the state police, the white-only highway patrol, were assigned to guard and watch Bingham at all times. So a white patrol car was parked outside the black home where he stayed at night in the midst of the Delta. White police followed him everywhere. Not only was this embarrassing, but it did make voter canvassing door to door in black neighborhoods rather awkward. Steve Bingham came to talk to us about the matter. His white police escort followed him to the Tougaloo campus. To have a white police car on campus was dangerous for the police as well as the rest of us. Tougaloo students would regard this visit as provocative. If word of the police presence spread on campus, students might attempt to rescue whoever the police had captured. Steve introduced me to the two officers at his car following him, and after a lengthy conversation, I persuaded the officers to park near my house, but just off the campus, right outside the fence and the gate. At my house, Steve parked his car where the other officer could see it. That was not enough. His escorts had orders to watch Steve constantly. I promised not to sneak him off the campus, but the police insisted on calling their headquarters. Orders came back. One of them had to keep watch and would have to follow this volunteer everywhere he went, including the house or den of the notorious hit Jeanette King. The other officer would have to stay and guard the police car. We accepted the situation. The man staying with the police car placed 2 rifles in plain view of the windows. Then I persuaded him to be much safer with the guns out of sight. I tried to get him out of the hot car, suggesting he sit in the shade of a nearby chinaberry tree and let us bring him a coat. The other officer, a very young man with a typically gaunt white Mississippi frame, followed Bingham into the infamous Tougaloo campus and even into our house. Jeanette, ever the perfect Southern hostess, did everything to make our surprised guest feel comfortable. Jane Stembridge, one of the earliest white Southerners to join SNCC, helped with the hospitality using her best Georgia drawl. 2 black co-eds seized the opportunity and helped with the entertaining, treating our guest as politely as if he were Dr. Aaron Henry, our COFO leader. The poor white policeman was in full uniform. Soon Jane had him describing the various insignia and interesting bits of his costume. Then she began talking about his gun. Jeanette murmured we didn't usually have guests in our living room who wore guns. Jane kept asking questions and said the man showed her his huge revolver. He took it from his waist belt and placed it on our dining room table. He pulled his chair up a little closer to the gun, but he did accept some iced tea and seemed to relax a little. Jane asked about all those big old bullets in your belt. He spread a handful of them out on the dining room table, telling us proudly they were special for this summer. He explained that most Mississippi people were using bigger guns this 1964 season with bullets that could kill a man every time. We were impressed. While the ladies kept up the conversation, Steve and I managed a few private words in another room, always reappearing often enough to reassure the officer. Steve placed some phone calls to the COFO office. The officer strained to listen, but I turned up the noisy room air conditioner and got him to tell me about those big old bullets. Soon the party had ended. Steve Bingham company had to return to the Delta. The officer did take a Coke and some cookies with him for the other officer as Jane smiled and said, "Bye now." And then Jeanette added, "Y'all come back now, you hear?"
I know that you all have thoroughly enjoyed this presentation. If we could have maybe one question that could be offered? If anyone has any questions. One question could be offered.
Reverend, were you at some of the concerts that were on Tougaloo campus at different times, different folk artists and artists that came through? Do you remember any of those?
That would be a good one. It's inspirational. I could close with a story. We had visiting singers. Pete Seeger came several times with no publicity. We'd have a concert. We'd let the stick workers and others would come out. In the year 63, 64, we had several events like this. We also organized a cultural boycott and got everybody from jazz musicians, Al Hurt, to Brigitte Nielsen from Bayreuth and the Metropolitan Opera to cancel concerts that blacks could not attend. And that cultural boycott became a model for South Africa and now for the Palestinian freedom movement. Late in the year 64, a few weeks before Freedom Summer started, Joan Baez gave a concert. This was organized by students from Millsaps College, a white Methodist school, Mississippi College, a white Baptist, Southern Baptist school, and Tougaloo. And we sponsored, and we brought in students from every school in the state. Several hundred white students attended an interracial event 6 weeks before Freedom Summer started. And they risked their lives, although many of them didn't understand it to do. It was great. Baez sang wonderful songs, told us stories. A little bit later, in the chapel building where we held this, I had my office as college chaplain. 2 black men came in, rushing in at dusk, and said, "They've come. There's a truckload of white men, at least 2, got out of their pickup. They parked in front of your house. There's a SNCC student civil rights meeting going on at your house." I didn't need to be there. The students could plot their own thing. And they took in a long package, and it looked like guns. We headed from our house. The 2 students had already alerted some other guys from the dorm who came out with their hunting rifles, surrounded my house, got there. I threw open the door, ready to come to the rescue. The troops are here. The cavalry has come. And on the floor was Bob Dylan and a friend with a guitar that had been... But what does that mean when normal American college students and a college professor and minister assume somebody has come with weapons to destroy you? That's where our minds were. That's where black minds have been for hundreds of years. And black people are raising questions now that we better understand our history if we're going to move forward.
Well, I can speak on behalf of myself as well as the audience that we feel greatly honored to be within your presence and to see what you have done and what you continue to do in the pursuit of justice for all of us. And thank you for all that you've done in the face of great opposition as well as danger so that we can have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that's commendable.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending this presentation, and I hope that you've enjoyed the rest of the Louisiana Book Festival, and thank you for attending.